Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Coates. It is truly an honor to be here today. I'll be frank, not too many farmers from north central Montana get the opportunity to speak here at Harvard. In fact, my bet is I'm probably the first one. Don't get me wrong, Montanans do value education. My grandmother, who settled in the Big Sky State in 1912, insisted that her children get a college degree. The importance of good education was passed down to my mother, who told me that public education and family farm agriculture were the cornerstones of our democracy. But it turned out that Harvard was a little beyond my reach. So instead of coming east, I headed southwest about 75 miles to the College of Great Falls, or what I would like to call Harvard of the West. Okay? But better late than never. After 40 years, I have a few things to say on my first visit to Harvard. A few things I've learned over a few decades in public service, a few things that I've learned in 2 high-profile campaigns for the United States Senate, a few things that I've learned about our campaign finance system in the age of Citizens United. So with that in mind, truly, thank you for the invitation. I am truly honored to be part of this event. These are critical times for our democracy and for the future of this country. We must have this conversation, but more important than that, it must make a difference. Because if we don't move forcefully and quickly to get big money out of elections, I believe it will give the wealthy a vice grip on our government. It will drown out the voices of regular folks, and it will embolden those with the deepest pockets to take further action to keep shaping their electorate how they see fit. So we do need action, and the sooner the better. But you may ask yourself, why am I your keynote speaker? What puts me in the middle of the debate over our campaign, finance reform, and our election system? First, I represent Montana United States Senate. This state has passed some of the most comprehensive campaign finance laws in our country. We have led the charge to keep, yeah, that's good. Thank you. It's for good reason, which I'll get into in a minute. We have led the charge to keep politicians honest and keep big money out of our elections. Montana's commitment to tough campaign finance law speaks to the character of Montanans, and it also speaks to my commitment to improving transparency and accountability in government, because I am one of those Montanans. As you know, in 2013, I introduced a constitutional amendment to clarify that corporations are not people. I also co-sponsored an amendment introduced by Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico to return the right to regulate elections to the federal government and to the states. And I have introduced an array of bills to improve transparency and accountability of government. Transparency and accountability were key issues during my first campaign in 2006 against former Senator Conrad Burns. My race against Conrad Burns garnered national attention. The campaign may be the first time that you heard of this 7-fingered farmer from Big Sandy. Burns had deep ties to a chap by the name of Jack Abramoff. Burns inserted earmarks that had nothing to do with Montana in the appropriation bill at Abramoff's request. His staff took trips on Abramoff's dime, and there was literally a revolving door between Abramoff's office and his. Corruption in the government became a major issue in this campaign, and I ran on a platform of cleaning up Washington. I gained traction because Montanans care deeply about clean, honest, and open government. It's part of who we are. It comes from our history and our geography. Now, many of you may not know much about Montana. It's a fairly large state. It's got a 545-mile border with Canada. The western portion of the state is covered with mountains. Tallest peak tops out at about 12,800 feet. But the most beautiful part of the state is the eastern two-thirds, which are the plains. That's where I live. We are also home of Glacier and Yellowstone National Parks, which, by the way, are now quite accessible due to some more regular air flights. So I would ask you to please come visit Montana, bring your money, and spend it there. But there's one thing you need to know for the purposes of this conversation today, and that is over 100 years ago, Montana was far ahead of the rest of the country when it comes to limiting influence of money in elections. Back in 1912, my grandparents had just started proving up their homestead. Back in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt had just finished serving as president of the Harvard Alumni Association. And in 1912, Montanans approved the Corrupt Practices Act that banned direct corporate spending in elections. We were ahead of our time, unfortunately, out of necessity. We demanded fair elections because we were tired of wealthy mining corporations operating our state government like it was a branch of their companies. For decades, mining companies sucked up wealth from our copper and our mineral reserves to build vast corporate empires. These corporations controlled newspapers, they intimidated workers, they bought influence among our lawmakers. One wealthy mining magnate, a chap by the name of William Clark, even purchased himself a U.S. Senate seat. He literally bought votes in the legislature by paying off mortgages, giving away ranches, and handing out envelopes of cold, hard cash. It was outrageous, and it was made possible by extreme wealth. As a result, Montana was run by the wealthy for the wealthy. Profits came first, ahead of workers' rights, fair laws, and the public's well-being. So, in 1912, Montanans took a stand and they passed the Corrupt Practices Act. Our campaign laws worked pretty well. In 1971, in fact, we even passed one of the most progressive state constitutions to date, enshrining into law protections for clean air, clean water, and the right to a quality education. 2 years ago, citing its Citizens United decision, the United States Supreme Court overruled Montana's Supreme Court and struck down the Corrupt Practices Act, 100 years after Montana voters had put it into law. Montanans quickly fought back, just like we did 100 years ago. In 2012, we passed a popular referendum by a margin of 3-1, calling on Montana's congressional delegation to overturn Citizens United. I have accepted that challenge, and I will keep fighting for my amendment because it's what Montanans want, and it's good for our country, and because I deeply believe that corporations and a wealthy few, with the support of the U.S. Supreme Court, are drowning out the voices of regular American citizens. I don't believe that's what the founders of our country wanted. They envisioned a country where everyone had a say in how we were governed, not just the privileged few. But today's system encourages lawmakers to listen to wealthy donors at the expense of their constituents. It puts the elite priorities first, and perhaps most importantly, today's system elects too many leaders from the political extremes who refuse to work together. The lack of compromise keeps us from tackling big issues. You know what they are: immigration, tax reform, education, just to name a few. These all need to be addressed if America is going to remain a world leader. But the importance that Montanans place on keeping the influence of corporations and big money out of politics is not widely shared with the American public. When the Supreme Court issued its McCutcheon decision in April, just 13% of the people surveyed by Pew said that they were following the rule very close. Looking at the Citizens United case back in 2010, just 20% said that they had heard a lot about that decision in the 2 weeks after the ruling. The remaining 80% said they had heard a little or nothing about that decision. Overall, the public does a better job following the Supreme Court. The same researchers who asked about campaign finance also found that nearly half the American public paid close attention to the health care ruling in 2012, and the number of people closely watching other Supreme Court decisions and big news stories dwarf those of campaign finance. Not even the explosion of money in politics is able to spur the public to demand campaign finance reform. The incredible increase in candidate and outside party spending in campaigns is well documented at this point. According to Wesleyan Media Project, ad spending surpassed $1 billion for the 2014 elections. According to the Center of Responsive Politics, the total price tag for midterm elections will be nearly $4 billion. And I believe we just saw the country's first $100 million Senate race in North Carolina. It was the most expensive midterm election ever, and it lays groundwork for a 2016 presidential that could break $10 billion. Now, how many better ways are there to spend the money than this? I bet you the folks in this room, myself included, could think of a lot better ways. The arms race between the candidates, the parties, the super PACs, and independent groups, no one can afford not to play this game, and we have the Supreme Court to thank for it. Citizens United let corporations and big money donors plow unlimited and unaccountable money into elections. And they blew open the doors of campaign finance with Citizens United. McCutcheon keeps tearing that house down. In 2012, just 1,200 Americans hit the contribution caps that McCutcheon case threw out. That's 1,200 people in a country of 320 million. This decision lets the elites spread their money and their influence further, giving them a say over more races and ultimately more lawmakers. Eliminating overall contribution limits to political candidates and parties and party committees is just one step away from eliminating individual campaign contribution limits. And we should be worried if we eliminate those individual limits, because it will turn candidates and lawmakers into puppets for the millionaires and the billionaires. Now think about it. Why put, if you're an elected official, why put the hard work of listening to your constituents when all you need is a couple rich friends? Why knock doors in a small town in Montana when you can go door to door in New York City? The Supreme Court, I don't believe, gets it. They studied law, politics, history. I think they're smart people, but they clearly don't understand the corrosive power and uncontrolled money in politics. They don't grasp the situation that's on the ground. Koch brothers rake in billions every year. The average Montana household pulled in $45,000 in 2012. Who do you think is going to have the bigger influence? Who do you think is going to run more ads? Who do you think will be able to threaten the lawmakers with outside advertising campaigns or punish politicians who don't bend to their will? The wealthy or the regular folks? And what message are we sending to the regular voters? The folks who put in an honest day work to make ends meet and don't see any progress coming out of Washington, D.C. They're telling them that their voices don't matter. They're being told, we don't care what you think. Just watch this advertisement paid for whatever group you've never heard of, whose donors live out of state and whose motives are unclear. That is really what our election system has come to. Maybe that's one reason why a recent Washington Post ABC survey found less interest in the recently concluded midterms than those in 2010 or 2006, and I think the voting turnout bore that out. The survey found that only a quarter of the registered voters, this is the registered voters, paid close attention to the campaigns. These folks, whether they be school teachers, bus drivers, farmers, or anyone else, want to believe that policymakers in Washington are listening to them, not some secretive super PAC with a name like Putting America First. Well, I'll tell you right now, if these groups are really putting America first, the first thing they can do is reveal their donors so that Americans know who's trying to buy their votes. It's a simple, straightforward step that I would like to see would increase accountability and transparency in a Montana kind of way. The explosion of money in politics is a threat to our democracy, and it's only made worse when that money is secret and untraceable. Together, they leave regular Americans on the outside looking in. I stepped into the post-Citizens United world in 2012. In 2006, spending by Conrad Burns and myself totaled about $15 million. Burns spent about 9.2, and I spent the remainder of that. And quite frankly, I won. I won by just a little over 3,500 votes. The race wasn't decided till the morning after Election Day. In 2012, a mere 6 years later, the total price tag for my 2012 Senate re-election race, spending by candidates and other groups, topped $50 million. A few over 400,000 voted, so that's over $100 a vote. Here are some of the numbers from my 2012 race. The Sunlight Foundation estimated about $14 million in dark, unaccountable money was spent. The Wesleyan Media Project, which tracks TV campaign ads, said nearly 90,000 separate ads ran from June through October, and that was more than any other Senate race in the country. In fact, over a three-week period in October of 2012, Montanans were exposed to more than 25,000 TV ads. Wisconsin, which has 6 times more people than Montana, came in second with fewer than 18,000 ads during that period. As a side note, I will just say, in the month of October, my Senate offices got calls from businesses saying, would you please take down some of your ads so we could run ours. All people saw on TV were Senate ads. That's it. And I think we can anticipate more of the same. And here's what really might be most compelling stat of all these. According to OpenSecrets.org, outside spending increased 600% from 2006 to 2012, from $4 million to $25 million bucks. That's in my race alone. It's a prime example of what Citizens United has done. It shifted power from the candidates to outside groups and special interests. Their hands is far stronger than it was just a few years ago. Americans are starting to tune out these millions of TV ads, and as they do, outside groups will use more and more social media and internet to drive certain voters to the polls while keeping others at home. It's one of the reasons I think we're seeing efforts by some to regulate the internet to their advantage. But numbers, just like words, don't tell the whole story. Sometimes it takes a picture. Yeah, I want you to take a peek at that, baby. It is a photo that caught the eyes of not only my press person on my campaign, but myself. If you will notice, can you see any difference? I don't want to give it away, but can you see any difference? If you take a look at the left hand, it looks a little bit different than it does today, and it did then. The National Republican Senatorial Committee gave me back my 3 fingers that I lost on a meat grinder when I was 9 years old on a farm. Now, I want to tell you, I really do appreciate the Republicans giving it back, because that may have been the only favor they did me during the campaign. But they didn't do it because they were feeling charitable. I think they did it because, number one, they were trying to make me something that I'm not, and they were sloppy, and they were out of touch. They did it because they didn't know Montana, they didn't know me, and like I said, it's not only those folks, it's other groups that have so much money to spend. They put their own priorities ahead of the folks that, in my case, in Montana. They weren't focused on issues that mattered most in Montana, like preserving our public lands or improving health care. But we worked hard. We got our message out. We had a great ground game, and I won by 18,000 votes in 2012, 5 times the margin that I won by in 2006. We had a strong race. We overcame that special interest money spending to get my message out. I was able to push back on the omnibus ads saying that I was ruining the country by reminding voters that I was a Montanan and I put Montana first. But most importantly, in order to do all that, to win that election, I had to play the game. To overcome the money from out-of-state groups like American Crossroads and Koch brothers, I spent hours on the phone raising money. I made phone calls in Washington, D.C. and Montana, even from airplanes. Don't tell the folks here. I traveled across the country, from California to New York and everywhere in between. Now, because of who I am, I don't believe my donors expected they were going to get anything special out of me. And it is always better for the money to go to the candidate because of transparency, if no other reason alone. We know who's donating to who. But every moment that I was forced to spend with a donor was a minute that I couldn't spend working on policy or talking to a constituent. The current system forces candidates to make decisions about how they're going to spend their time. It pulls them away from their jobs that they were elected to do, and it forces them to choose between raising money to make sure voters hear their message or laying down and letting the opposition walk all over them. It's an arm race that everybody's got to play, and by far the biggest loser is the American people. I consider myself a survivor of the post-Citizens United era, but others haven't been and won't be so lucky. Some candidates simply will not be able to raise the money needed to compete the big outside spenders. More disturbing, for me at least, is there's a lot of good people that could fill this position that won't because they see what happens in these elections. Further down the ballot, it becomes even tougher. And races that were traditionally nonpartisan will become political and nasty as money seeps into more campaigns. Take the 2 Supreme Court races this last just completed election in Montana. One was more or less business as usual. The other became highly political. In that race, mailers and TV ads hit the incumbent over his past rulings and affiliations. An independent group called Montanans for Fair Justice jumped into the fray. Spending skyrocketed, rebuttals were aired, and people retreated to their ideological corners. Academic institutions even got involved. Thank God not this one. The challenger called the incumbent judge a liberal activist, saying the incumbent, quote, judges like a Democrat. He received tens of thousands of dollars from the National Republican State Leadership Committee. Special interests came to dominate that Supreme Court campaign. Remember, this is a position in the judicial branch. The branch is supposed to be above the political fray, so it can make decisions based on law. It leads me to ask two questions. What does all this spending mean, and where are we going to go from here? From a government standpoint, it means that we simply can't compromise over big pieces of legislation. A lot of folks in the Senate talk about working together, but the fact is that they talk about reaching across the aisle. Getting that done is a whole different thing. Why? Because the threat of big money coming after them in the next election holds them back. I've seen colleagues hesitate to introduce bills that are popular in their home states because they were afraid it would spur big moneyed interest to spend millions to defeat them. When that happens, that leaves constituents without a real say from the folks who represent them. Lawmakers are held back by hostile political climate these expensive campaigns create. When you can constantly see an ad that distorts your record, and then you see a fellow out-of-state senator that endorses it, it makes it hard to compromise on legislation. Politicians also know that most money in campaigns is on the extremes of the political spectrum, and the extremes fight almost any sign of compromise and the opportunity for folks to work together to get things done. Case in point, I mean, we can't even confirm ambassadors in the United States Senate. It's because it compromises a dirty word. It leads me to wonder, could we do big things today like our predecessors did? Could we build an interstate system? Could we put a man on the moon? Supporters of our current system defend their views by citing the constitutional right to free speech. But I can guarantee you, our founding fathers, men like Washington and Jefferson, weren't envisioning our current campaign finance system when they said Congress couldn't prevent someone from speaking out. Leaders like Washington and Jefferson had visions for this nation, but they knew America would change with the times as technologies were developed and new lands came into the Union. Montana was not a state back in 1787. And if the framers warned against political parties, I can only imagine what they'd say about the rise of super PACs. It is time to ask, who's protecting free speech of the regular working class folks? Who's protecting the voice of the school teacher, the repairman, from being drowned out by special interests? There's been a lot of talk about amending the Constitution to get our election system back under control. I had mentioned my amendment with Senator Udall's. I had mentioned that my amendment with Senator Udall's amendment earlier. I want to make it clear, I do not want to limit First Amendment rights. Growing up in Montana, I have a deep respect for the Constitution and what it stands for, and I do not take amending the Constitution lightly. But this election system is broken. We must take action. There are small steps and there are large ones. All are necessary. Here's an example of a seemingly simple piece of legislation, in addition to my constitutional amendment, that I have introduced to require all Senate candidates to electronically file their campaign finance reports. I can't see if the lady's here today. Yeah. There she is, right there. Okay. It's 2014. We've got phones that allow us to communicate instantly around the world, and we have satellites that can pinpoint our location within a couple of feet. But Senate campaigns don't have to file their finance reports online, making them instantly available to the public. Now, here's what really gets me about it. Presidential candidates have to, House candidates have to, the Senate doesn't. We're still back about 20 years. Instead, government workers print out reams of paper and enter them into a database one by one. It costs the taxpayers about $500,000 a year. It costs workers time, and it can prevent campaign finance reports from being available until after the election's over. My bill's supported by over half the Senate. It would pass if we could get it on the floor for a vote, but because of Senate rules, one person can hold it up. One person can keep Americans in the dark. On behalf of those Americans who need a voice, we can't sit on the sidelines. Because if we don't rein in the abuses in our campaign finance system, if we don't pass legislation to get big money out of the elections, and if we don't give regular Americans a real say in how They are governed. We might as well hang a for sale sign on the Capitol. We will embolden a wealthy few and corporations to keep marching forward. We'll have a government that works, but only for the privileged. Because sometimes, just like we saw in 2012, in Montana and nationally, groups like Koch brothers won't get their ways. They'll spend millions of dollars to buy votes, but Americans will still have their say. So they'll take the next step. It's one we're seeing in Texas, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and other states. In those states and many others, third parties are pushing laws to keep certain folks from the voting booth. They see work being done by one side, so they're fighting back by weakening voter protection laws, by restricting same-day voter registration and early voting, and requiring certain identifications to vote. Just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court allowed Texas to use a strict voter ID law in its recent election. In her dissent, Justice Ginsburg said the court risked denying the right to vote to hundreds of thousands of eligible voters, many of them African American and Hispanics. What it all boils down to is this: if big money can't get you to vote how they want you to, then they're going to do everything they do to keep you from voting. With this Supreme Court on their side, they're shaping their electorate to their whim. Out goes one person, one vote, and in comes more backroom deals and more cigar smoke. Our election system is becoming one big arms race. From your TV screen to your local precinct, corporations and big money are determining the influence on who votes and how they vote. This should not be a partisan issue. Folks on both sides of the aisle demand campaign finance reform. It's not partisan in Montana. When I go home, I hear it from everybody. When they see the ads or the mailers from out-of-state groups, they don't like it. There's only 1 million of us, but we have a history of interference in our elections. But this issue needs to resonate beyond Big Sandy, Montana, or the Big Sky State. There needs to be more events like today's, and these events must lead to real change. Like most issues, it's going to take strong grassroots pressure to make Congress take notice and change course. And without a return to at least a pre-Citizens United landscape, I think we're headed for a scandal soon. I mean, mark my words, all the money sloshing around in our political system will lead to another Watergate-type event. It won't be easy to reform our election system, but we must keep trying. To me, efforts like the Disclose Act and the constitutional amendments, they're just not for show. They are the keys to keeping our country great. And when I look at what we need to accomplish, policies that empower and grow the middle class, modernize immigration and our education system, and a budget that supports future generations, I see campaign finance reform as the critical building block. If we get big special interest money out of the elections, it will force lawmakers to listen to their constituents. Those constituents, regular folks like you and me, want compromise. They want politicians to work together to forge solutions and move us forward. But without campaign finance reform, it's going to be very difficult. And we will continue to have the debate dominated by the loudest and the wealthiest and the most self-interested. At its heart, the debate is about what kind of government we want to pass down to our kids and our grandkids. They deserve a government that works for them, one that's transparent, fair, and honest. You know, Cambridge is a long way from Big Sandy. But despite the distance, I think the values are the same. You and I can be a part of the solution. Our work can be remembered for changing the direction of this country, for living up the ideals of our founding fathers, and for accomplishing something no one thought we could accomplish. It's truly an honor to be here. It's an honor to speak to you on what I think is maybe the most important issue that we face in this country today, one that holds the fate of our country in its hands. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you. Gee, that's good. You'll make my head grow. Thank you very much. Standing ovation at Harvard. I hope you got that on tape. Yeah.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and the way this is going to work, just to make sure there are questions, and that's the only reason, if you can write them down on the blue note cards that are throughout the room. Carolyn here has some more. Do we have some already? Not yet. If anybody wants a blue card, please just raise your hand and Carolyn will take them to you. If you have a question, raise it up and hand it in to me. Thank you. In the meantime, while I take a look at these, I will ask you a question, which I know a lot of people in the room probably have in their head, which is a constitutional amendment is a really hard thing to pass.
Yeah.
And the odds of any particular amendment getting through are really low.
Yeah.
What are some practical ways that we can think, either individual citizens or yourself or organizations like Free Speech or places like Harvard can get across how bread and butter this issue is? Because that's the belief that it's not a bread and butter issue.
Look, I think that you've already started. I mean, I talked to some folks this morning that had some things on the ballot that to go out and educate people on a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, and I think that's a good way to go. I think initially, the low-hanging fruit in all this is transparency. I mean, I think that if we could make these monies transparent, I think it would solve a good portion of the problem. And what I'm saying is this: if right now I can turn on TV if I'm up for election, and there will be ads run, and it'll have some fancy name that sounds good, and I will not know. I will not know where that money came from. I don't have a clue where that money came from. And if it was transparent, then I could look back and say, all right, business X put in $100 million into this effort. What's businesses X's relationship with Montana? Find out what that relationship is. That may give me an ability to explain it. If they have no relationship, that would give me an ability to explain it. The example I use is, in 2012, I got attacked for voting for equal pay for equal work for women. Now, I'm going to tell you, in Montana, if that was put on the ballot, it'd probably pass the same 3-1. But now, they didn't run ads saying that. But the group that funded the thing had a top 10 list of screw-ups that I had, and that was one of them. And so, if we could have known that, we could have got back and we could have had a fighting chance. So I think transparency is the most important thing at this point in time, and I think it's just education on the ground.
Got it.
Yep.
So here's a question for you as a Senate Democrat. Why you mentioned that the Senate rules, the one person hold.
Yeah.
Why didn't the Democrats get rid of that? And they obviously did change the rules on some of the confirmation procedures, but this one's still there. And I gather we don't even get to know who the individual is who's holding.
Well, you're supposed to now.
You're supposed to.
Yeah, I actually know who held the filing bill up. But the truth is that. I think, when my predecessor Mansfield was in there, it was 67 votes. It wasn't 60, it was 67. I don't think the problem is with the rules. I think the problem is with the people that are in there. And, no, it's the truth. The truth is if there's some correlation between people and animals, I'll just tell you that. Being a farmer, I hate to say this, but it's a fact. And I'm telling you, if you can hold something up and feel you don't have to suffer, you're going to continue to do it. And there's no pain felt with a filibuster. And I don't think we should necessarily take away the filibuster, but I do think that there needs to be some sacrifice that has to apply. A few years ago, we had a guy put a hold on a bill, and then we had a vote on it, he wasn't even there. He went home, put the hold on it and went home. That's not right. And so what I would say is there's ways. I personally am somebody who thinks that we should have a talking filibuster, and we ought to play that card, and we have to look, whoever the party is in the majority, or whoever the party is on the other side of the filibuster, has to sacrifice too. But what the heck, do it. I think the problem isn't the rules; the problem is the people.
Okay, several people have essentially the same question, which is how can you appeal to Republicans on these issues more effectively, and particularly given Montana's place, what can you say about that?
Well, the government shutdown happened about a year ago right now, and we didn't get much input on the government shutdown until the government shut down. And then we got a lot of input on the government shutdown. I think, and by the way, people reacted pretty fast, and it ended relatively quicker, longer than it should, but it ended relatively quickly compared to what it was going to look like. I think how you get Republicans is to hear from constituents. And I don't mean to put it like it's, because when I go home It's a fact. A good friend of mine who's a Republican, the first thing he said to me on Wednesday morning after the election, are you going to go back and fix the election system? That's the first thing he said to me. So it's just not a Democrat issue. It's just right now, I think, for political purposes, I think Republicans think that it's advantageous to them. It's over the long haul not, and it will change over the long haul. But I'm concerned that if it goes for a long time, we may not be able to get it back. So I think public input to their, folks say it doesn't do any good to call, doesn't do any good to write letters or send emails. That couldn't be further from the truth, and I would do it with regularity.
Say one more word about within Montana, your friend, Republican perspectives on campaign finance. Why don't they agree with the apparent position of at least some of the Republican leadership that that more money is better for them because Republican policies are about pursuing wealth, and people who pursue wealth will reward them, and that's all a nice circle of virtue from that perspective. Why don't Montanan Republicans see it quite the same way?
I think we've experienced, even though it was 100 years ago, it's well documented, we've experienced what happens when you just let things run. I mean, Clark, basically bought himself a seat, but that's what happens when you let things go unregulated in this particular area. I mean, it's just the way it is. It's human nature. And I think that Montanans, they don't remember it, but they read the stories and say, we don't want to go back there again. And then there's other reminders of that too. I mean, those folks who mined that copper and created a lot of good jobs in that process has left us with the biggest Superfund site in the country. And that corporation's gone. And so now it's up to the taxpayers to pay for that, in the most part. There's a little bit being paid out of the person, the company that bought it. But for the most part, it's being paid for by the taxpayers. And I think they remember that too. And yeah.
So here's a different question. Talk a bit, please, about the effect of the current campaign financing system on how lawmakers make decisions, how much time they spend on fundraising. You alluded to this in your remarks. What the fundraising hours look like. How does that change the way that the elected officials relate to the public?
Well, I think when you're in cycling, it varies with the person. It just depends on how gabby you are. I mean, you'll spend probably a third of your time making fundraising phone calls. I can tell you that's part of it. I think a bigger part of it is that we had a bipartisan bill that we worked on, housing finance reform, and there was a group of people that did not like the bill that started running ads this last spring against the people who were on the banking committee to get them to back off that housing finance reform bill. That housing finance reform bill was a really good bill. It saved some money, protected taxpayers, kept a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. But there was one little small segment who happened to be pretty well money that didn't like it, and that bill ended up not going anywhere. Now, I don't know if it was because of that or something else, but the truth of the matter is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac need to be fixed. And we had a chance to do it, and it didn't get done, and there were moneyed interests that didn't want to fix. So it has its impact on legislation, but moreover, I don't know if you guys probably all raised money for something, whether it's Harvard or something, but it's great to call people and talk to them and ask them for money if you're a little bit warped. But the truth is, I can't think of many other things I wouldn't rather be doing. Picking rock or hay bales, anything is above that.
Does Montana's state constitution have limits on contributions or donor transparency or the like? Yeah.
The Supreme Court overturned it.
That was part of the...
Yeah. We still have limits on legislative races. Yeah, I think it's $170. That's still there. And I don't know about Supreme Court races, Justice, do you know? 320. So those limits are still there.
how much do you think, in order to get something done at the federal level, how much is going to have to take place first at the state level?
Well, look, Constitution Amendment, absolutely. I mean, that's a heavy lift. That's a big one to go. But I think what needs to happen, I think what's more quickly is the people, the general public on the ground, making their voices heard, and then that impacts both the state and the federal. So you get 2 for 1 on that one.
Do you support the Shareholder Protection Act, which would give shareholders of public companies a vote on corporate political spending?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we just had that conversation, didn't we?
But a lot of people in the room didn't hear that.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I was for it till I heard the conversation. No, I think I still am. As the one gentleman pointed out, you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, I think it'd be a good thing.
What is this? What can we do to elect candidates who would do the job well, who are intelligent enough to be unwilling to put up with today's campaigns?
Well,
yeah. Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'll just tell you that there are tons of people that I know that could do this job as good or better than I. I talked to one in the airport yesterday. Smart guy, great family, knows the issues inside and out. We don't agree on everything, but he's sharp as hell. And he told me, he says, I would never do your job. I would never put myself and my family through what you guys have to put yourself through, not just during election season, but all the time. And that's the problem. The problem is you end up with people in Congress over time. I don't think we're there yet, but over time that, I mean, can't do much else. I mean, really, or they'd do it.
You're stuck,
let me tell you.
Yes.
I don't, look, just for the camera's sake, I like all the people I serve with. I think they're all good people.
Last question. What about public campaign financing? That's obviously an alternative system used in most other major democracies. How do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I would certainly be open to, It's got to be bipartisan in the way it's done, and we're not going to get any of this done without bipartisanship, by the way. It's got to be both sides working together on it. I would be more than happy to look at any proposal. I think that it really gets dicey. Saying at Harvard Law is kind of ironic, but I mean, the free speech angle is very dicey. So if you start putting limits on the amount of time, which quite frankly I would love if it was only a year, but any kind of campaign finance system, you need to achieve balance so that the incumbent doesn't have a big advantage and the challenger doesn't have a big advantage, and that's really tough. I mean, it's tough to do, and but I mean, I think if good minds got together, they could probably come up with a system. It would probably be a hybrid, quite frankly, of public and private dollars that would help the candidates get their message out and tell the people who they really are without trampling on the free speech stuff. I mean, I can tell you that I do not believe the electorate in 2012 in Montana was better informed after $50 million was spent compared to 2006 when $15 million was spent, okay? They weren't better informed. They had a lot more information was put on the TV to the point where you turn on nightly news and that's all you saw, and so you shut it off. And thank God for early voting, because maybe we got to some of those folks they talked them out of voting for me. But the truth is that this system needs to be fixed. Whether we do it with transparency, whether we do it with a constitutional amendment, whether we do it with public finance or a hybrid system of public finance, I think there's plenty of opportunity for success out there. We just need the people to speak up more, and I don't mean that as a cop-out, but I mean that as a fact. If people started making this a big issue that you heard as much about on the nightly news as we heard about Ebola for the last 2 weeks, things would change, and that's a fact. Thank you all. You've been great. Thank you.